Well, last week we brought you news of bombshell leaks from the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, or WPATH as it is known. The leaks contain discussions from internal WPATH message boards and videos of WPATH clinicians discussing the gruesome gender reassignment surgeries that they perform on little children to help them change gender. Now, WPATH is headed by transgender activist Marcy Bowers, a man who identifies as a woman. He is a California-based pelvic and gynecologic surgeon, and he thinks there should be no age limits on children transitioning their gender. WPATH is important because it is a key authority for Australia's child gender clinics, where in the past 10 years there has been an epidemic of children reporting with gender confusion. I'm about to put on screen the cover of the Australian Standards of Care and Treatment Guidelines for Trans and Gender Diverse Children and Adolescents, which has been produced by the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. Now, the Australian standards say, and I quote, "The recommendations made in this document are primarily on clinician consensus, along with previously published standards of care from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health." Now, WPATH treatment guidelines and position, that's from the WPATH treatment guidelines and position statement. Now, the Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne, and the Victorian Health Minister, Mary-Ann Thomas, deny that girls under the age of 18 are allowed to have double mastectomies, i.e. have their breast surgically removed so they can present as boys. Now, in response to a question on notice from expelled Liberal Moira Deeming, Mary-Ann Thomas told Parliament that the Royal Children's Hospital, quote, "does not provide or refer children to surgical treatment," end quote. But let's look at the RCH-produced Australian standards. This document says, quote, "in alignment with the recommendations of WPATH, SOC version 7, chest reconstructive surgery is regularly performed across the world in countries where the age of the majority of medical procedures is 16 years. Now, last week, I said that leading Australian paediatrician Professor John Whitehall was spending the week examining the WPATH leaks. Professor Whitehall joins me now. Professor, thanks so much for taking the time to go through these documents and to join us today. What was the most disturbing thing you found as you went through the leaks?
I think the fact that they whitewashed, that is to say ignored, all the known side effects of puberty blockers, and this was an internal discussion amongst themselves, which was leaked, and they're raising questions with each other. And they never mentioned any of the side effects of it, except they came close to talking about sterility and loss of sexual sensation in boys who had been put on blockers. So the whole issue then came and said, we simply don't know. We expect. And then somebody said, in all their experience, they had never found a boy who had been started on puberty blockers who was capable of orgasm, let alone of reproducing the species. So and then they said amongst themselves, yes, this is difficult. We are trying to explain to a child what will happen if we block puberty and what will happen to its development and what will happen to future marriage and reproduction and stuff like this. And they're saying, how can we explain this to a child who has no idea of biology? And then someone else said, well, you know, they say they understand, and I'll say that's because they're scripted, but we don't think they do understand. And someone said, you try and talk to a 9-year-old or a child about future reproduction, it's like talking to a blank wall. Mm-hmm. So all of these things are confessions by people on the job as to the impossibility of discussing with the child their sexuality, their future identity, their procreation, and so forth. Now, the problem is that in the Children's Hospital in Melbourne and in other children's hospitals in Australia, they start preparatory discussions with 9-year-olds as to how they will give them, administer puberty blockers at 9 years old, so that the child then allegedly will understand and not be a brick wall. And then when the first sign of puberty comes, then they will actually, the second size, then they can start these puberty blockers. So that's what they're saying, even though they're then admitting that they never met a child who in fact had started at this Tanner stage 2, who subsequently was able to function as a male. And yet that's what shocked me. They are saying, well, we've said all along, how can you explain this to a 9-year-old boy? How can you do that?
Well,
he doesn't know his left ear from his right. And yet they're agreeing with that.
Yeah.
They're agreeing with that. That's the WPATH. Now, you know what? You have mentioned the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. When WPATH was formed it was 2009 or something like that, the director of the Melbourne Children's Hospital there, in accordance to their own official history of AusPath, which is the independent but associated organisation to WPATH, they're talking about it, that the director down there, in association with other people, were concerned about the age limits in the WPATH documents, which suggested that second stage transformation to becoming in the opposite sex, that is to say, administration of cross-sex hormones, shouldn't be given before 16. Now, the Children's Hospital down there decided, well, that's not right, because, and therefore they did away with the age limits. So it was the Australian innovation from Melbourne that did away with the age limits, which ultimately were ratified by AusPath and the Australian so-called guidelines, and then were secondarily adopted by the WPATH. So we are leaders in this.
That's fascinating. So we've actually helped inform WPATH's appalling standards. John, you mentioned sexual function and sterility, these sort of things, but in the leaked documents, Marcy Bowers, this transgender activist, this man presenting as a woman, surgeon in California, he says that the issue of fertility is unknown, that the research doesn't show anything. But that's not what the internal documents and that's not what the internal discussions are showing. How can the issue of fertility be something they don't understand as a consequence when they've surgically removed a boy's penis, for instance?
Yeah, well, to be fair to them, I don't think they're doing penectomies at that young age. That would come later on when there was a surgical transformation to it.
Well, they talked about it in vaginoplasties in adolescents and teenagers.
Oh yes, I agree. And that certainly is that, you could call that, I mean, there are several stages there. The social affirmation, your dress and your name changes, blah, blah, blah. The second one is you take this puberty blockers. Third one, cross-sex hormones. And fourth one then would be surgical transformation. We know from the records when the family court used to be obliged to make this decision public, we know that there were 2 girls, this was several years ago, who had mastectomies performed at the age of, how old they were 17. So we know that this goes, but now the court is not obliged to let you know. And the people who do it, I don't know. I doubt it, quite frankly, because it would be such a big hoo-ha if the Children's Hospital in Melbourne was doing these things. But there are plenty of people in the private hospitals who would sign up for that. And we don't know. There's no accounting to it.
Well, that's right. We revealed on the program last week social media posts from a mother of a 15-year-old Victorian girl who said that the Royal Children's Hospital had referred her daughter for a double mastectomy. So certainly they're not against it. And of course, the WPATH guidelines that the Royal Children's Hospital references talks about 16-year-olds. John, have these leaks completely discredited WPATH? And should Australian clinicians stop using it as an authority for standards of care here?
Well, sadly, and if you use the term thoroughly discredited, I think they will still have their believers and their defenders. And this is an ideology, and somehow or other they'll slip around it by saying, well, we're saving lives, when there's no evidence that that happens. I think that they will somehow or other justify it. Sadly, it ought to discredit it, when here you've got the international group who's arguing we should do this to children, and that they themselves are saying it's like talking to a brick wall. So yes, but sadly, I don't know that it's going to make that much difference.
Yeah. John, even before same-sex marriage, which destroyed the idea of gender complementarity in the definition of marriage, you were one who was warning about the flow-on consequences to the idea of gender itself. Have you been surprised at how quickly activist clinicians have taken over the field of gender dysphoria and the treatment of children? Have you been surprised just at how thoroughly they've just come to dominate the space of caring in this area?
Yes, that's the big question. How did this happen? When I first heard of this, and I've been a paediatrician for decades, when I first heard of this issue that a boy could claim he's born in the wrong body and so forth, was in 2016, when the director of the Melbourne Children's Hospital presented in the conference in Cairns. Now, I couldn't believe, I was walking past, and you could go into this lecture. I went in because I had nothing better to do, and I couldn't believe it. So I rang 28 of my colleagues, just out of interest. Have you ever seen this? You ever heard about it? And a cumulative experience of 931 years, they could only remember 12 patients, 10 of whom they remembered because of associated psychiatric disease, and 2 were the result of long-standing dreadful sexual abuse. In those days, we used to teach that if a child is saying they're born of a different, or they're a different sex, you think child abuse. So that's back in 2016. Now, it's not just hundreds in Australia, but probably thousands of children in Australia who are claiming that they're born in the, or led to claim, or induced to claim that they're born in the wrong body. Orange is considering having a gay Mardi Gras. And one of the features of the gay Mardi Gras is the public reading of little books for children, such as My Shadow is Pink. Now, in this beautifully produced little book, there's a little boy, and he's unhappy, and he's got a domineering father, and he would like to twirl and dance and be free. So that the message basically is that you are in fact not a boy. You are better off being affirmed as a girl. Now, this is a public, in my opinion, recruitment to a psychological diagnosis. This is public psychotherapy. If little children are unhappy, father domineering, blah, 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 what's the answer? Oh, the answer is a gender issue. Now, that's now in the public parks in Orange. So, whereas before it was never heard of it. And more into, if you went the other way in Victoria and you said, oh, you're unhappy, you've got a difficult father and blah, 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 we need to have counselling, we need to work out why you're unhappy, we need to diagnose that you've got a psychiatric comorbidity or you're autistic or other things like that. And we set about trying to make the child comfortable in the skin in which it was born, to quote someone else's phrase, rather than affirm them to the other gender. Where you live, you can go to jail for 10 years. Yeah, that's called conversion therapy.
Conversion therapy, that's right. John, that's extraordinary because, look, I've always believed, and your professional experience shows it, that there is a correlation between the political activity of the same-sex marriage activists. You mentioned discovering this in 2016 at a professional conference in Townsville, 1 year before the definition of marriage was changed in law. And of course now, as you say, even councils like Orange City in regional New South Wales are looking at drag queen story times in their own mini version of the gay Mardi Gras. John, from a professional point of view, just quickly in the short time we have left, how should we be caring for children who are struggling with their gender? And I think I know what you're going to say, but I presume what you're going to say is probably going to be illegal in states like Victoria and probably soon in New South Wales if the likes of Alex Greenwich gets his way with his so-called equality bill.
And also in this Australian Human Rights Commission, whereby to criticise painfully or whatever the transgender movement will be a crime against humanity. It'd be very, very significant issues. Let me just get back to the Orange, because just to emphasise, what they are practicing is conversion therapy. You have a little boy who's unhappy, what are you going to do? You're going to convert him into being the opposite sex with all the hormones and all that sort of stuff. That's conversion therapy. Now, that won't be this won't be an immoral sort of criminal act. It's the other way around. So what do we do with the little boy? Okay, we sit down and work it out. This is called psychotherapy. This is called psychiatry. Now we're banning psychiatry. We look for coincidental, like comorbid abnormalities, and we deal with them. Before we start all this transgendering business, that's now the message out of Finland and Norway, and certainly now out of England, that you deal with the problem of the child, the general problem of the child, before you start giving all the puberty blockers. So other countries are moving or have moved in that direction, especially England in the last week. But we are putting laws into place to criminalise against human rights abusers if we, in fact, go along that pathway. That's the anomaly here. We are leaders in Australia in many ways. But sadly, we are leaders in the punitive approach to getting in the way of the so-called ideology of affirmation. We are leaders in that.
No, well said. Well, Professor, unfortunately that's all we have time for today, but really appreciate you taking the time to read through the WPATH leaks and, of course, your advocacy on behalf of vulnerable children over many years, warning about this. Is very much appreciated. Let's hope that some common sense breaks through into the profession and into our politicians sometime soon before more kids are harmed. Professor John Whitehall, thanks for your time.
Okay, kids, have we got time for an amusing anecdote out of the WPATH, or we got to go?
No, look, absolutely, John. I didn't think we could find anything amusing out of that, but go for it.
Well, it's a sort of it's a sick joke, I suppose. But
yeah.
What they're saying is that psychiatric disease should not stop you transgendering that person. Frank schizophrenia. Now, that's not funny. But what might be funny is there used to be the idea that you could be possessed by multiple personalities. Right? Split. You can have 7 personalities all telling you what to do. They're acknowledging this idea that you can have multiple personalities. They call them alters. Not altar as you would worship, but an altered identity. So when you come with that position, your head's filled, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, and you have to persuade all your alters that you are a girl when you're not. Otherwise, there might be the difficulty in getting sued by the practitioner. So somehow or other, this person could come, has got 15 alters in his head, all telling him what to do, contradicting and arguing amongst themselves. And what he has to do is sit down and get his alters, a unanimous consensus of the alters. Yeah, you really are a girl, go for it, mate. How do you do that? It's like madness.
It is madness. John, look, the day will come where people will look at the rainbow flag and understand this madness and harm that it's causing. Yeah, thank you again for sharing your insights and for taking the trouble to go through those documents. We really appreciate it.